Howdy, folks, and welcome back to Tales from the Dusty Trail. The West was a land of second chances, or so the stories go. But what happens when a man's second chance is burned to the ground and salted with the blood of innocence? Before we ride that hard road, do this old storyteller a favor, hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell, because you won't want to miss the storm that's coming. Now, pull your chair closer to the fire. And let me tell you about the day the devil stopped driving a stagecoach and started collecting souls. This is the story of Jack Rowan. The sun over the Jornada del Muerto was a merciless, white-hot coin in a bleached blue sky. It baked the cracked earth, tortured the scraggly mesquite, and beat down on the 6 weary souls trundling south in the Concord stagecoach. At the rain set Jack Rowan. To his passengers, he was just the Druvera quiet, sun-weathered man in his late 30s with hands calloused by leather and a gaze that seemed fixed on the distant, shimmering horizon. His eyes, the color of a faded storm cloud, held a deep, settled weariness that spoke of a peace hard won. This was his penance, his quiet purgatory. Driving the mail and passenger line between Santa Fe and El Paso was monotonous, grueling work. The heat, the dust, the endless threat of broken axles and lame horse, it was a small price to pay for anonymity. A small price to pay for keeping the promise he had made to his wife, Sarah, on her deathbed. No more guns, Jack. No more killing. He had buried her 2 years ago, and with her, he had buried the man he used to be. The man they called the Reaper of the Rio Grande, the man whose name alone could once clear a saloon. He had buried that man deep, under a mountain of quiet, lonely days just like this one. His passengers were a typical manifest of humanity crossing this god-forsaken stretch of New Mexico. There was a portly, wedding salesman from back east named Abernathy, whose constant complaints about the dust were as predictable as the sunrise. In the opposite seat sat a young preacher and his wife, the Clarksons, their faces filled with a fragile, hopeful faith that seemed hopelessly out of place in this landscape. And then there was the girl. Her name was Eliana. She was no more than 8 years old, with eyes as dark and deep as a desert night. Jack had picked her up in El Paso under the direct, non-negotiable order of the territorial marshal. She was a witness, the survivor of a trafficking ring that had been broken up just days before. She was being sent to a convent in Santa Fe, the only safe haven they could find for her. She hadn't spoken a single word since he'd lifted her onto the coach. She just clutched a small, crudely carved wooden bird in her hand, her knuckles white. Jack saw the ghosts of 100 border war atrocities in her silent, haunted gaze. He had spent his life making orphans. Now, his job was to deliver one to safety. The irony was a bitter taste in the back of his throat. He had tried to offer her a piece of jerky earlier. She had flinched away, her eyes wide with terror, and he had retreated, the chasm between his violent past and his peaceful present seeming wider than ever. The ambush came with the sudden, brutal finality of a lightning strike. There was no warning. One moment, there was only the rhythmic clatter of hooves and the creak of the coach. The next, the world exploded. A rifle shot, sharp and deafening, cracked from the rock formations to their left. The lead horse on the right screamed, a terrible, high-pitched sound, as it stumbled and went down, its legs shattered. The entire coach lurched violently, throwing the passengers into a heap, and ground to a halt in a cloud of dust and panic. Before the dust had settled, they were surrounded. Figures rose from behind the rocks, their faces covered with red bandanas. There were at least 8 of them, moving with the practiced, deadly efficiency of wolves circling a wounded deer. They were not common highwaymen. There was a military precision to their movements. "Everyone stay in the coach," Jack yelled, his voice a low, commanding bark that was a relic of his past. The driver he was now would have been terrified. But the man who awoke in that instant was not the driver. It was the Reaper. Abernathy, the salesman, didn't listen. Panicked, he threw open the door and tried to make a run for it. "Take my wallet. Take it all," he screamed. A single shot rang out. Abernathy collapsed face first into the dust, a dark hole appearing in the back of his fine wool coat. The preacher's wife screamed. The leader of the bandits stepped forward. He was a tall, rangy man with cold, dead eyes visible over his bandana. He moved with a confident swagger, a long-barreled revolver held casually at his side. As he drew closer, Jack's blood ran cold. Carved into the wooden grip of the man's pistol was a symbol Jack knew as well as his own reflection in a dirty mirror. A coiled serpent, painted a dull, blood red. The Red Coil. A vicious gang of ex-Confederate guerrillas and scalp hunters he had fought a bloody, personal war against years ago. He thought he had wiped them out, thought he had killed their leader, a man named Colonel Thorne. But a snake's brood is not so easily exterminated. The bandits dragged the preacher and his wife from the coach. Mr. Clarkson stood defiantly in front of his wife, his Bible held up like a shield. "In the name of God, I beseech you," he began. The leader laughed, a harsh, grating sound. He backhanded the preacher across the face, sending him sprawling. Then he leveled his pistol at the crying woman. "God ain't out here, preacher," he snarled. Two more shots echoed in the oppressive heat. The Clarksons fell together in a bloody heap. Jack sat frozen on the driver's box, his mind a maelstrom. His promise to Sarah was a roaring fire in his head. No more killing. He was unarmed. His own pistol was locked in the strong box, a requirement of the stage line. He was helpless. Then, he heard a small whimper from inside the coach. Aliana. The leader heard it too. He motioned for one of his men, who ripped open the coach door and dragged the terrified little girl out, her small wooden bird falling to the dust. She didn't scream. She just stared, her eyes wide with a horror that no child should ever know. Something inside Jack snapped. The promise to his wife, the years of quiet penance, the carefully constructed peace-side all shattered into a million pieces. He launched himself from the driver's box, not with a weapon, but with the pure, kinetic fury of a cornered animal. He slammed into the man holding Ileana, his shoulder connecting with the man's jaw with a sickening crunch. He grabbed the man's pistol as he fell, turned, and fired, all in one fluid, terrifying motion. The shot took another bandit in the chest. Jack fired again, the bullet hitting a third man in the throat. The muscle memory, the cold, deadly calculus of combat, came back to him as naturally as breathing. For a fleeting second, he was the Reaper once more. A rifle butt slammed into the side of his head, and the world exploded in a flash of white light. Another blow caught him in the ribs, and he felt a sharp crack. He fell to his knees, the stolen pistol kicked from his hand. He looked up, his vision swimming, just in time to see the leader standing over the crying little girl. Jack tried to scream, to move, to do something, but his body wouldn't respond. The leader looked down at Ileana, then glanced at Jack, a cruel, mocking smile in his eyes. He slowly, deliberately, raised his pistol, one with the red serpent on the grip, and fired. The small, frail body crumpled to the dust. The world went silent. Jack felt a pain far deeper than his broken ribs or the gash on his head. It was the sound of his own soul breaking. The leader walked over to him and kicked him hard in the stomach. "Should have just stayed on the box, driver," he sneered. "Now you can die with them." He turned to his men. "Burn it. Burn it all." Jack lay there, helpless, as they splashed oil from the coach's lanterns over the wood and the bodies. He watched as they lit the match. The flames roared to life, a funeral pyre in the middle of the empty desert. The last thing he saw before the blackness took him was the Red Coil bandits riding away, their laughter swallowed by the crackle of the fire and the indifferent wind. He didn't know how long he lay there. Hours. A day. He awoke to the stench of burnt wood and cooked meat. The fire had died down, leaving the blackened, skeletal remains of the stagecoach and its passengers. He dragged himself to his feet, his body a symphony of pain. He stumbled through the wreckage, his eyes hollow. He saw the charred remains of the preacher and his wife, locked in a final, macabre embrace. He saw Abernathy, his fine coat now just a blackened rag. And then he saw her. Aliana. Her body had been just far enough from the coach to be spared the worst of the flames. She lay on her side, her face peaceful, as if she were only sleeping. Clutched tightly in her small, still hand was the little wooden bird, and touched by the fire. Jack knelt, his body screaming in protest. He gently pried the bird from her fingers. He looked at the small, pathetic toy, and then at the carnage around him. He looked up at the vast, empty sky. The promise he had made to Sarah was dead. It had died with this little girl, on this patch of blood-soaked sand. He had tried to be a good man. He had tried to live in peace. But the desert didn't care for good men. It didn't care for peace. It only understood survival, and it only respected violence. He stood up, the wooden bird clutched in his fist. The weary, tired eyes of the stagecoach driver were gone. In their place was something ancient and cold, a fire that had been banked for years, now roaring back to life. It was the gaze of an executioner. He was no longer Jack Rowan, the driver. He was the reaper, returned from a grave of his own making. And he had a harvest to collect. The sun was a merciless hammer, and the desert was its anvil. For Jack Rowan, every step was an act of rebellion against a body that craved the final, quiet surrender of death. His ribs were a cage of broken glass, his head a drum of ceaseless thunder. But the physical pain was a distant echo, drowned out by the roaring silence where his soul used to be. The image of Eliana falling to the dust was burned onto the back of his eyes, a permanent afterimage of his failure. He walked. He didn't know for how long. Time had become a meaningless concept, measured only in the agonizing cycle of sunrise and sunset. He followed the deep ruts of the stagecoach trail, a ghost haunting his own life's path. He was fueled by a single, cold imperative: keep moving. He stumbled into the Harmony Creek way station looking like a specter conjured from the very dust of the trail. His clothes were stiff with dried blood, his own, and that of others. His face was a mask of grime and sunburn, but it was his eyes that stopped the station master mid-sentence. They were the eyes of a man who had stared into the abyss and found it staring back. Good God, Rowan. What happened? The station master, a balding, portly man named Henderson, stammered. Jack didn't answer. He stalked past him to the water barrel, ladled cup after cup, and drank with a thirst that seemed unquenchable. The small community of the way station gathered, their faces a mixture of horror and morbid curiosity. The sheriff, a man named Gable whose gut spilled over his gun belt and whose main concern was keeping the peace within the confines of the saloon, approached him cautiously. Jack, we heard shots yesterday. Figured it was heat lightning, Gable said, his voice weak and reedy. Was it bandits? Jack finally turned, his gaze sweeping over the frightened, useless faces. He saw no help here, no justice, only fear. He fixed his storm-cloud eyes on the sheriff. They're all dead, he said, his voice a raw, gravelly sound he didn't recognize as his own. Everyone. He didn't wait for the sheriff's sputtering questions. He ignored Henderson's offers of a doctor. He walked to the corral, his movements stiff but resolute. He purchased a sturdy-looking buckskin with the last of his driver's wages, the coins feeling like foreign objects in his hand. He saddled the horse with a grim, single-minded focus. He was no longer a part of this world of mundane transactions and frightened men. He rode out of Harmony Creek without a backward glance. But he didn't ride toward the civilized comforts of Santa Fe or the company lodgings. He rode west, toward the jagged peaks of the Oregon Mountains, toward a place of ghosts and memory. Hours later, he arrived at a ruin. It was the skeleton of a small ranch house, its timbers blackened by a fire years ago. A single, stone chimney stood like a tombstone against the setting sun. This was where he and Sarah had built their life, and where it had ended when a fever took her. After her death, he couldn't bear the ghosts, and he had walked away, leaving the shell of their life to the wind and the coyotes. He dismounted, the horse nervously sniffing the ash-scented air. He walked through the doorway that no longer existed and across the floor that was now just packed earth. He stopped in the corner where their bed used to be. He knelt, the pain in his ribs a sharp, insistent reminder of his new purpose. He pried at a section of the floor that looked undisturbed, a set of floorboards that had survived the fire. They came loose, revealing a dark, hollow space beneath. From that space, he pulled a long, heavy package wrapped in oilskin, slick and dark. It felt alien, and yet intimately familiar in his hands. He carried it outside into the last, blood-red light of the setting sun. With slow, deliberate movements, he untied the leather thongs and unrolled the oilskin. There it lay, Lucille. It was a Colt Bundline special, but one customized to a gunfighter's deadly specifications. The barrel was a full 12 inches long, giving it an accuracy that was legendary. The standard trigger guard had been removed for a faster draw. The original grips had been replaced with dark, smooth walnut, worn to a perfect fit for his hand over thousands of draws and countless rounds fired. It was not a tool of law or sport. It was an instrument of death, a thing of terrible, functional beauty. He had buried it the day after he buried Sarah, a physical manifestation of his promise. Now, that promise was as dead as the woman he had made it to. He sat with the gun across his lap as darkness fell. He did not need light. His hands knew the work. He broke it down, cleaning each part with a cold, mechanical efficiency. The scent of gun oil was a dark perfume, an aroma that unlocked a chamber in his memory he had tried to seal forever. The soft click of the cylinder spinning, the satisfying snap of the loading gatite was a terrifying and familiar liturgy. He was not just cleaning a gun. He was resurrecting a part of himself he had tried to kill. He was welcoming the Reaper home. When he was done, he loaded 6 brass cartridges, each one a nail for a coffin yet to be built. He holstered the weapon, the long barrel heavy against his thigh. It felt right, as if a missing part of his own body had been restored. He returned to Harmony Creek under the cover of darkness. He didn't go to the way station. He went to the saloon. It was a place of noise and false cheer, a world he no longer belonged to, but a place where information was bought and sold. He sat at a corner table, a specter in the shadows, his eyes scanning the room. His target was a freight driver named Scully, a man known to have a loose tongue when drunk and even looser morals when sober. Jack waited. He watched Scully down 3 shots of cheap whiskey. Then he moved. He didn't threaten. He didn't ask. He sat down opposite the man, placed a silver dollar on the table, and simply stared. Scully, unnerved by the intensity in Jack's dead eyes, began to stammer. "Rowan, heard what happened. Terrible. Just terrible." "The red coil," Jack said, his voice a low growl. "They need to sell their goods. Move their stolen horses. Who's their fence in this territory?" Scully paled. I don't know nothing about that kind of business, Jack." Jack didn't move a muscle. He just continued to stare, the silence more menacing than any threat. Finally, the freight driver broke. "Look," he whispered, leaning forward, his eyes darting around the room. "I ain't saying I know, but a man looking to move hot merchandise. He might find his way up to Gallows Creek. The Silver Camp. Ask around for a man named Silas. Runs the SE office. But you didn't hear it from me." Jack stood up, leaving the silver dollar on the table. He turned and walked out of the saloon, leaving the freight driver sweating in his chair. He had a name. He had a destination. The ghost had his gun, and now he had a scent to follow. Gallows Creek was less a town and more a festering sore on the face of the earth. It clung to the side of a mountain that wept a toxic, metallic-smelling runoff from the silver mine that was its sole reason for existence. The single, muddy street was a treacherous river of filth, lined with saloons, brothels, and a few ramshackle buildings that passed for legitimate businesses. The air was thick with the reek of cheap whiskey and washed bodies, and the ever-present, cloying despair of men who had traded their futures for a handful of silver dust. This was the Red Coil's natural habitat, a place where law was a joke and life was cheap. Jack rode into this mire not as a lawman or a hero. He was something older, more primal, a hunter, and a hunter does not announce his presence. He left his horse at the dilapidated livery and moved into the town on foot, a gray, anonymous figure in the teeming, desperate crowd. His duster was stained with the trail. His face was unremarkable, but Lucille, holstered low on his hip, was a statement of deadly intent to those who knew how to read the signs. His first stop was the undertaker's office. It was a small shack at the edge of town, the smell of formaldehyde a grim counterpoint to the town's other stenches. An old, skeletal man with hands stained by his trade looked up as Jack entered. "Looking for a plot," the undertaker rasped. "Information," Jack said, his voice quiet. "Last few days. Anyone brought in with a fresh gunshot wound. Maybe a point for caliber." He was checking if any of the men he'd shot with the bandit's pistol had made it this far before dying. The undertaker cackled, a dry, rattling sound. "Mister, in Gallows Creek, that question is like a skin of horror if she's seen any men." "Be more specific." Jack described the 2 men he had shot. The undertaker thought for a moment, then shook his head. "Nope. Had a miner crushed by a cart and a fella stabbed over a card game. But no new gunshot victims. They either lived, or they're buzzard food." It was a dead end, but a necessary one. Jack left the shack and began his slow, methodical stalk. He didn't go to the SE office. He didn't ask for Silas. To do so would be to alert his prey. Instead, he used the town's most potent currency, fear. He spent the rest of the day observing, a ghost in the saloons and gambling dens. He watched the men who walked with the arrogant swagger of predators, the ones who wore the faded gray of old Confederate uniforms. He identified the low-level thugs, the jackals who ran errands for the wolves of the Red Coil. He chose his target as dusk fell, the young, pimple-faced kid with a cruel mouth and a pistol he clearly didn't know how to use, who had been running whiskey for a group of harder-looking men. Jack followed him as he left the saloon to use the outhouse in the back alley. The alley was a narrow, stinking chasm between two buildings. As the kid stepped out of the outhouse, Jack materialized from the shadows. He didn't say a word. He simply slammed the kid against the rough-planked wall, his forearm pressed hard against his throat. "Silas," Jack growled, his voice a low whisper of violence. "Where do I find him?" "Go to hell," the kid choked out, trying to reach for his gun. Jack's other hand shot out, grabbing the kid's wrist. With a calm, deliberate pressure, he bent the wrist back until a sickening snap echoed in the alley. The kid screamed, a high, thin sound of agony. "The finger is next," Jack said, his voice utterly devoid of emotion. "Then the arm. Then the other arm. I have all night." Terror replaced the kid's bravado. Tears and snot streamed down his face. "The assy office," he sobbed. "He works out of the back room. He's there now, going over the last shipment. Please, please." Jack released him. The kid collapsed to the ground, cradling his broken wrist, his sobs the only sound in the alley. Jack turned and walked away without a second glance. The assy office was a small, respectable-looking facade on a deeply rotten business. A single lamp burned in the front window. The front door was locked. Jack didn't bother with it. He moved around to the back, where a single, barred window looked out from the back room. He peered through. He saw a portly, balding man with a green eyeshade sitting at a desk, hunched over a large ledger. This was Silas. He was alone. Jack tested the back door. It was barred from the inside. He took a step back, raised his boot, and kicked. The wood splintered, the lock burst, and the door flew inward with a crash. Silas screamed, jumping from his chair and fumbling for a pistol in his desk drawer. He was too slow. Jack was already in the room, Lucille in his hand, the long barrel looking like a cannon in the small space. The hammer was cocked, the sound of final, deadly punctuation mark. "Don't," Jack said. The word was cold enough to freeze blood. Silas froze, his hand hovering over the pistol. Sweat beaded on his forehead, dripping from his nose. "Who are you? What do you want?" "Take the money. Take it all." "I want the men who attacked the El Paso stage," Jack said, stepping closer, his boots crunching on the splintered wood. I don't know anything about that," Silas stammered, his eyes wide with terror. "You're the Red Coil's fence," Jack stated. "You handled the goods, the horses, the valuables. You know who they are. You know who leads them." "I just moved the product," Silas pleaded. "I don't ask questions. It's just business." Jack raised Lucille, aiming the pistol squarely between the man's terrified eyes. "My business is with them. You are standing in my way." The fence broke. The words came tumbling out in a desperate, pathetic rush. He admitted to fencing their goods for months. He gave Jack names low-level thugs. He described the new leader, a ruthless man he only knew as Show. But then he said something that made Jack's cold focus sharpen. "This last job, it was different," Silas whimpered. "They didn't just bring me trinkets and horses. They were looking for something specific. From the cargo, they were tearing the strongbox apart. They seemed disappointed, angry, like they didn't find what they were really after." "What were they after?" Jack demanded. "I don't know. I swear," Silas cried. "But it wasn't a normal robbery. They weren't after money. They were after paper." Paper. The word hung in the air. Jack's mind flashed to Abernathy, the salesman, and his locked satchel. The attack wasn't random. It was targeted. He had what he needed from Silas. The fence had served his purpose. "Please," Silas begged, tears streaming down his face. "I told you everything. Just let me go." Jack looked at the man, a pathetic cog in a machine of murder and greed. He thought of Eliana. He thought of the Clarksons. He thought of the promise he had made to Sarah, a promise this man and his kind had made impossible to keep. "No," Jack said. The shot was a deafening roar in the small room. Silas was thrown backward, a look of shocked surprise on his face, before his body collapsed over the desk, scattering papers and upending an inkwell. Jack stood in the silence, the smoke curling from Lucille's long barrel. He felt nothing. No remorse. No satisfaction. This was not vengeance. This was work. A grim, necessary task. He had followed the scent of rot, and he had found its source. But he knew, with a cold certainty, that the snake itself was still out there, hiding in the dark. The air in the small office was thick with the coppery smell of blood and the acrid scent of gunpowder. Jack ignored the body of the fence slumped over the desk. He was not a lawman collecting evidence. He was a hunter following a trail. And Silas's last word paper was the freshest track. He began to search the office with a cold, methodical purpose. He was not looking for money or valuables. He was looking for a ghost. A motive. He rifled through the drawers of the desk, tossing aside shipping manifests and assay reports. He checked the safe. It contained only silver and a small amount of cash. Nothing. Then his eyes fell on the fireplace. It was cold and swept clean, but a few blackened, half-burnt scraps of paper were caught in the grate. Silas had been burning something. Jack carefully retrieved the largest piece. Most of it was illegible ash, but a corner had survived, the paper singed and brown at the edges. On it, written in a neat, clerical hand, were a few lines of text. It was a fragment of a ledger page. There was a list of named Spanish names he didn't recognize, and next to them, figures listed in acres and dollars. But it was the heading at the top of the page that made his blood run cold. It read AT&SF Railway Land Acquisition Survey Private Audit. AT&SF. The Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe Railway. The pieces began to fall into place with the force of a physical blow. Abernathy, the fussy salesman from back east. He wasn't a salesman at all. He was an auditor. A company man. The locked satchel he carried wasn't full of product samples, it was full of account books. And the red coil hadn't attacked the stagecoach for the mail or the passengers. They had attacked it to get that satchel. To get that ledger. This wasn't a robbery. It was a corporate assassination. Jack clutched the burnt piece of paper. This was the key. He had to know what was in that ledger. He left the assay office, melting back into the filth of Gallows Creek, leaving the body of Silas for the town's indifferent morning to discover. His journey to the AT&SF territorial headquarters in Santa Fe was a grim, silent ride. He was no longer just chasing the killers of a little girl. He was pulling at a thread that he suspected was connected to a much larger, more venomous web of power and greed. The railway office was a bastion of New World efficiency and arrogance, a clean, brick building that stood in stark contrast to the dusty adobe of old Santa Fe. Jack walked in, looking like a relic from a bygone, more violent era. He didn't ask for the man in charge. He asked for Abernathy's supervisor, claiming to be an associate from the El Paso office with urgent news. He was led to the office of a man named Mr. Davies, a pinched-faced man in a starched collar who looked at Jack's dusty clothes and holstered cannon with unconcealed disdain. "You have news of Mr. Abernathy?" Davies asked, his voice crisp. "His coach is 2 days overdue." "His coach was attacked," Jack said flatly. "There were no survivors." Davies's face went pale. The color drained from his cheeks, but the look in his eyes was not one of grief. It was fear. Pure, unadulterated fear. The ledgers," Davies whispered, his voice barely audible. "Did you recover his satchel?" "The coach was burned. Everything was destroyed," Jack lied. He watched the man's reaction, saw the flicker of something that looked like relief behind the fear. This man was involved. "A tragedy," Davies said, recovering his composure. "A true tragedy. A loss for the company." Jack laid the burnt scrap of ledger paper on the polished desk. "I found this in the wreckage," he said, his eyes locked on Davies. "It seems the bandits were after more than just the strongbox." Davies stared at the paper as if it were a live scorpion. He began to sweat. I have no idea what this is." "A shipping manifest, perhaps." "It's from a private audit," Jack said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "An audit of the company's land acquisition for the new Mesilla Valley Spur. An audit that I'm guessing was not authorized by the board of directors in Boston." Davies broke. He was a man of paper and numbers, not of violence and cold-eyed reapers. He stammered out the story, the words tumbling over each other in a desperate bid to save his own skin. "Abernathy had been sent by the main office. There were rumors of irregularities, of vast sums of money disappearing into the land acquisition project. The company was supposed to be buying land from settlers at fair market value, but the audit revealed something far more sinister. A powerful, shadowy figure was using the red coal to terrorize, murder, and drive landowners off their property. Then, a front company would swoop in and buy the abandoned land for pennies on the dollar, selling it back to the railroad at an exorbitant markup. It was a massive scheme of extortion and murder, generating a fortune for the man at the top. Abernathy's ledger contained all the proof, the names, the dates, the money trail that led directly to the architect of the entire operation. Who was he? Jack demanded. Who was behind it all? I don't know, Davies cried, shrinking back in his chair. I swear. Abernathy kept that name close. He said it was a man with too much power, a man who had the territory's politicians in his pocket. He said the name was only in the final summary of the ledger. He was taking it directly to the U.S. Marshals. The massacre now made perfect, brutal sense. They hadn't just been trying to steal the ledger. They had been trying to erase a conspiracy from existence. And they had slaughtered 8 innocent people to do it. But the man who runs the front company, Jack pressed. The one who deals with the red coal. You must have a name for him. Davies hesitated, then seemed to realize that his only path to survival was to feed the wolf at his desk. Thorne, he whispered. Marcus Thorne, a land baron in San Miguel. He presents himself as a pillar of the community, a philanthropist. But he's the one who handles the transactions. He's the money man. Jack stood up, the burnt piece of paper now feeling like it weighed 100 pounds. He had his next link in the chain. Marcus Thorne, a respectable gentleman who built his fortune on a foundation of corpses. He turned and walked out of the office, leaving Davies trembling in his chair. The trail was no longer just about a band of savage killers. It led to the perfumed parlors and smoke-filled back rooms of the so-called civilized world. And Jack Rowan was going to burn it all down. San Miguel was a different kind of desert. It wasn't a wasteland of dust and rock, but a more complex ecosystem of power, influence, and carefully concealed violence. The streets were wider, the adobe buildings grander, and the saloons were paneled with dark, polished wood instead of rough-hewn planks. The law here wasn't just a single, fat sheriff. It was a web of magistrates, deputies, and lawyers, all of whom, Jack suspected, were caught in the orbit of one man, Marcus Thorne. Jack rode into town not as a specter of vengeance, but as a quiet observer. He knew he couldn't simply walk up to the Thorne estate and demand a confession. A man like Thorne was insulated by layers of money, influence, and, most importantly, hired guns. To get to the spider, he first had to clear the web. He spent the first 2 days listening. He sat in the back of cantinas, nursing a single beer for hours, his ears tuned to the whispers and boasts of the town's underbelly. The name Marcus Thorne was spoken with a mixture of reverence and fear. He was a benefactor, a job creator, a man who was bringing progress to the territory. But Jack heard the darker underneath stories of ranchers who had mysteriously sold their land for a fraction of its worth, of prospectors who had vanished after striking silver on Thorne's claims. He needed a name, a direct link between the respectable Thorne and the butchers of the red coal. He found it on the 3rd night, from an old, drunk vaquero who had once worked for Thorne's vast cattle operation. Thorne, the old man slurred, he don't get his own hands dirty. For that, he has Cortland. The name was spoken like a curse. Cortland. He was Thorne's enforcer, his chief lieutenant, a man who had appeared from nowhere a year ago and quickly established a reputation for ruthless efficiency. He was, the vaquero whispered, the man who handled Thorne's special projects, the man who met with unsavory characters from the Badlands. Jack now had his target. He spent the next day hunting Cortland, not with a gun, but with his eyes. He found him easily enough. Cortland was a tall, handsome man with a neatly trimmed mustache and the cold, confident eyes of a killer who enjoyed his work. He dressed in tailored suits but wore his pistol tied down low, a clear sign that his civility was only a thin veneer. Jack began a tense, silent cat-and-mouse game through the streets of San Miguel. He shadowed Cortland, learning his routines. The enforcer moved between Thorne's office, the bank, and a high-class saloon called the Crystal Palace. He was careful, always watching his back. But he was arrogant. He believed himself untouchable in this town that his boss owned. Jack knew he couldn't confront him in public. He needed to isolate him, to drag him out of his carefully controlled environment and into Jack's world of shadows and violence. He crafted a simple but effective trap. He learned that Cortland was overseeing a large shipment of cattle, set to be loaded onto trains at the sprawling stockyards on the edge of town. That night, Jack slipped into the stockyards. The place was a labyrinth of wooden pens and narrow alleyways, smelling of livestock and damp earth. He found the loading chute where Cortland's prize cattle were being held and, with a few quiet snips of a wire cutter, opened a gate that led to a series of smaller, more remote pens. Then, he started a small, controlled fire in a haystack at the far end of the yards. The resulting chaos was exactly what he'd planned. The fire created panic, the cattle began to stampede through the open gate, and the stockyard workers were thrown into disarray. A frantic worker rushed to the Crystal Palace to fetch Cortland. Enraged that his perfectly planned shipment was in jeopardy, Cortland arrived in a fury, just as Jack knew he would. He stalked into the dark, confusing maze of the stockyards, shouting orders, his arrogance making him reckless. Jack waited for him in a narrow, muddy alley between two high-fenced pens. As Cortland stormed past, Jack stepped out of the shadows. "Cortland," he said, his voice low. The enforcer spun around, his hand instinctively dropping to his gun. He saw Jack, a tall, grim figure standing in the moonlight, Lucille held loosely at his side. "Who the hell are you?" Cortland demanded. "I'm the man who's going to balance a ledger," Jack said. "The one written in blood on the Jornada del Muerto. Tell me about the red coil." Cortland's eyes widened with a flicker of recognition, and then narrowed. He didn't waste time with words. He drew. He was fast, impressively so. But Jack was not just fast. He was elemental. Lucille seemed to leap into Jack's hand. The long barrel roared once. The shot was perfect. It took Cortland in the shoulder of his gun arm, spinning him around and sending his pistol flying into the mud. He cried out in pain and shock, collapsing against a fence. Jack walked toward him, the hammer of his Colt already cocked for a second shot. He knelt beside the wounded man, the muzzle of Lucille inches from his face. "Thorne paid you to hire them," Jack stated. "He paid you to get that ledger." Cortland glared at him with pure hatred, clutching his shattered shoulder. "You're a dead man. Thorne owns this territory. This territory is about to have a new owner," Jack said, his voice as cold as the grave. "The red coil. Who's leading them now?" "Go to hell," Cortland spat. Jack pressed the long barrel of Lucille against Cortland's kneecap. "The next shot won't be as clean. I want the name of the man who led the attack on that stagecoach." The enforcer's bravado finally broke, replaced by the raw terror of a man facing a force of nature. He knew this wasn't a lawman. This was a reckoning. "Shaw," he gasped, the name torn from him. "Caleb Shaw. A crazy son of a bitch. Thinks he's some kind of goddamn prophet of war." Jack froze. The name hit him with the force of a physical blow, a ghost from a past he had tried to bury even deeper than his guns. Caleb Shaw. He remembered a young, eager face, a boy who had been a phenomenally gifted marksman, but with a streak of cruelty that had always unsettled him. A boy he had trained. A boy he had molded. Cortland saw the flicker of shock in Jack's eyes and tried to take advantage of it, lunging for his fallen gun with his good hand. It was his last mistake. Lucille roared a second time. The shot was final. Jack stood up, his mind reeling. This wasn't just a mission of vengeance anymore. It was a penance. The monster who had murdered Ileana, who had led the massacre, was a monster of his own making. He had unleashed Caleb Shaw upon the world, and now, it was his duty to put him down. The name Caleb Shaw was a key that unlocked a room in Jack's memory he had sealed shut with iron and rust. He saw a dusty training ground on the Mexican border, a weary, 19-year-old kid with eyes that burned too brightly, a kid who could shoot the pips out of a playing card at 50 paces. Jack had been his commanding officer in a rough-and-tumble company of territorial rangers. He had seen the boy's rattling, but he had also seen the disturbing pleasure the boy took in the act of killing, the coldness that settled in his eyes after a skirmish. Jack had tried to temper it, to channel that aggression into a soldier's discipline. He had promoted him, trusted him. He had thought that by giving the boy responsibility, he could tame the wolf inside. He had been wrong. He had only taught the wolf how to hunt more effectively. The realization transformed his quest. The cold, clear line of whose vengeance now twisted back on itself, becoming a circle of his own making. He was not just an avenger, he was the source of the evil he was hunting. The rage that had fueled him was now complicated by a profound and bitter guilt. This wasn't just about punishing the wicked anymore. It was about erasing his own greatest, most terrible mistake. He left San Miguel, leaving the body of Cortland for Thorn to find, a clear message that the walls of the land baron's fortress had been breached. He knew he couldn't get to Thorn yet. Not until the red coil, Thorn's sword and shield, had been shattered. Not until Caleb was in the ground. He needed to find them. The red coil had no single, fixed base. They were a roving plague. Jack turned to the only man he knew who might have a line on such whispers, a man who was himself a ghost of the border wars. His name was Elias Vance, a one-eyed ex-army scout who now lived a hermit's life as a trapper in the high country of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The journey was a pilgrimage into his own past. The mountains were a world away from the sun-scorched desert, a place of tall pines, cold streams, and a silence that invited introspection. As he rode, the memories of Caleb's show were relentless. He remembered the bull bragging after a raid, the casual cruelty he showed to prisoners, the way his eyes would light up at the prospect of a fight. Jack saw every warning sign he had ignored, every instance where he had chosen to see a soldier's zeal instead of a killer's bloodlust. He found Elias's cabin nestled in a high, hidden valley. The old scout was gaunt and weathered, his one good eye as sharp and discerning as a hawk's. He greeted Jack not with surprise, but with a weary resignation, as if he had been expecting this dark ghost from his past to appear eventually. "Rowan," Elias rasped, spitting a stream of tobacco juice. "Figured I'd see you again one day. You got the look of a man who's dug up something he should have left buried." They sat by Elias's fire, sharing a bottle of whiskey. Jack didn't tell him everything. He didn't speak of Eliana or the promise to his wife. He just spoke the name. Caleb Shaw. Elias's good eye narrowed. "Heard that name on the wind," the old scout said, his voice low. "He's taken the dregs of the old Red Coy and added 100 guns for hire. They say he's more than just a bandit leader. He's a prophet. Fills his men's heads with stories of a new nation, a kingdom of fire and powder for men like them. He's charismatic. And he's crazy. A bad combination." "Where are they?" Jack asked. "They've holed up for the winter," Elias said, poking the fire with a stick. "Found themselves a fortress. An old, abandoned mission town south of the Malpais. The Mexicans called it Purgatorio. A fitting name. It's walled, got its own well. Defensible as hell. Shaw's been using Thorn's money to turn it into his own private kingdom. Purgatorio." The name settled in Jack's gut like a stone. He had his destination. As he prepared to leave the next morning, Elias stopped him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Jack," the old scout said, his voice serious. "This ain't just another fight. This kid, Shaw, he knows you. He knows how you think. He knows your tactics. He learned at your knee." "I know," Jack said, his voice grim. "You ain't just hunting a man, Jack," Elias continued, his eye filled with a deep, sad wisdom. "You're hunting your own shadow." Jack nodded once, a silent acknowledgement of the terrible truth. He mounted his horse and rode south, leaving the peace of the mountains behind. He was riding toward a town named for Purgatory, to face a demon of his own creation. The Malpais, the Badlands, was a sea of black, volcanic rock, a jagged, broken landscape that seemed hostile to life itself. Purgatorio sat in the heart of it, an island of crumbling adobe in a sea of desolation. From a high mesa a mile away, Jack watched the town through an old brass spyglass. Elias had been right. It was a fortress. The town was built in a square on a central plaza, enclosed by a high, thick adobe wall. There was only one main gate, reinforced and watched by men on the roof of the gatehouse. Sentries were posted on the corners of the wall and on the roof of the largest building, the mission chapel, its bell tower now a sniper's nest. Inside, Jack could see the movement of dozens of mercenaries and outlaws Caleb had gathered to his banner. They were well armed and confident, secure in their impenetrable stronghold. Jack knew a direct assault was impossible. It would be suicide. But he had not come here to fight Caleb's army. He had come here to exterminate it. He was not a soldier anymore, bound by rules of engagement. He was a force of nature, and he would use the desert's most powerful weapons, patience, silence, and the slow, creeping certainty of death. For 3 days and 3 nights, Jack became a ghost. He circled the town, never sleeping in the same place twice, his movements hidden by the broken terrain. He was a phantom on the mesas, observing, learning, and preparing his battlefield. He watched the guards change, noting their routines, their sloppiness, the way they bunched together to share a bottle or a cigarette. He saw the path the water carriers took from the town's central well to the various barracks. He noted the location of their main ammunition store, a small, heavily guarded stone building near the chapel. He was not looking for a way in. He was turning the entire town into a weapon against itself. On the 4th night, under the cover of a moonless sky, his work began. He moved like a shadow, a whisper of death at the edges of the fortress. He started with the well. He had a small pouch of potent, tasteless dessert herbs, a poison he'd learned of from the patch years ago. It wasn't fast-acting, but it was debilitating, bringing on fever and a gut-twisting sickness that would cripple a man within hours. He slipped over a low section of the back wall, silent as a cat, and contaminated the town's only source of water. Next, he turned his attention to the structures themselves. Using a knife and a small hand drill, he worked on the supports of the wooden awning outside the main saloon, a place where he'd seen off-duty guards congregate. He weakened the sun-baked wood until it was held together by a prayer, ready to collapse under any significant weight. In a narrow alleyway between the barracks and the blacksmith shop, a common patrol route, he set a simple but brutal tripwire, connected not to a noisemaker, but to a heavy, precariously balanced anvil on the blacksmith's roof. He spent the next night setting smaller traps, a patient, meticulous predator laying his snares. He loosened the rungs of a ladder leading to a watchtower. He frayed the main rope holding a large cargo net full of supplies. He was not just preparing for a gunfight, he was preparing for a slaughter. He was sowing the seeds of chaos and confusion, turning the mercenaries' own environment against them. During his long, silent vigil, he watched his primary target. He saw Caleb Shaw several times. His former protege had grown into a man. He was tall and charismatic, moving through his men with an air of absolute authority. He would stand on the steps of the chapel, preaching his gospel of fire and blood, and his men would listen, captivated. Jack watched him, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. He saw the same burning eyes, the same cruel twist of his lips. He saw the monster he had failed to smother in its cradle. On the final night of his preparations, he made his boldest move. He needed to create a single, devastating blow to initiate the chaos. He crept toward the ammunition store. It was the most heavily guarded building in town, with 2 men always at the door. He waited for the 3 a.m. guard change, the moment of greatest complacency. As the 2 sleepy guards from the next shift shuffled to their post, Jack struck. He used a throwing knife, a silent, deadly skill from his past to take out the first man. The second guard turned, his mouth opening to shout a warning, but Jack was already on him, his hand clamping over the man's mouth, a knife sliding between his ribs. He dragged the bodies into the shadows. He had a small bundle of dynamite sticks, acquired from a disgruntled miner in Gallows Creek. He worked quickly, placing the charge at the base of the stone building's weakest wall. He set a long, slow-burning fuse. He retreated back to the mesas, his work done. He found his final position, a sniper's perch 1,000 yards away, offering a commanding view of the entire town. He lay down with his rifle, not a standard weapon, but a heavy, .50 caliber Sharps, a gun capable of killing a buffalo or a man at over a mile. He settled in to wait for the dawn. He had turned Purgatorio into a massive, intricate trap. He was no longer just a man with a gun. He was the architect of this town's destruction. And as the first, pale light of morning began to silhouette the town against the dark rock, he knew the time for ghosts was over. The time for the Reaper had come. Dawn broke over the Malpais, painting the black rock in hues of orange and blood. In the town of Purgatorio, the fuse Jack had lit hours earlier finally reached its destination. The world erupted in a deafening roar. A massive, blossoming fireball engulfed the ammunition store, sending a shockwave that shattered windows across the plaza. Stone, wood, and bodies were hurled into the air as tons of black powder and cartridges cooked off in a spectacular, secondary explosion. The day in Purgatorio began with an apocalypse. From his perch 1,000 yards away, Jack watched the chaos he had unleashed. The blast served as a brutal alarm clock. Men, half-dressed and panicked, poured out of the barracks, shouting and running in confusion. The carefully constructed order of the fortress dissolved into a terrified mob. This was the moment Jack had been waiting for. He settled the heavy Sharps rifle, its weight a familiar comfort against his shoulder. He drew a bead on the first clear target, a man on the roof of the gatehouse, trying to organize a response. Jack exhaled, his mind a place of cold, clear calculus. The rifle boomed, a deep, thunderous sound that was a full second ahead of the bullet's impact. The man on the gatehouse simply vanished in a red mist. Panic turned to terror. The mercenaries realized they were not just dealing with an explosion, they were under attack from a ghost they couldn't see. They scrambled for cover, their discipline shattered. This was when Jack's other traps began to spring. A group of 6 men rushed to take cover under the saloon's awning. As the last man crowded underneath, the weakened support beams gave way. With a great groan of tortured wood, the entire structure collapsed, burying the men under a ton of timber and adobe. Screams of pain and surprise were quickly silenced. Another patrol, running blindly down the alleyway near the blacksmith's, hit the tripwire. The heavy anvil from the roof above descended with sickening speed, crushing a man and scattering the rest like quail. The poison began its insidious work. Men who had taken their morning drink from the wall began to double over, their guts twisting in knots, their strength failing them. The sickness spread through the ranks, silent and invisible, more demoralizing than any bullet. Jack continued his methodical, long-range assassination. He was not a wild shooter. Every shot was a deliberate, calculated act. He targeted the leaders, the men who were trying to rally the others. He targeted the snipers in the bell tower, his powerful rifle punching through the thick adobe walls as if they were paper. He was a god of vengeance, dealing death from an unseen heaven, his targets chosen and dispatched with chilling precision. Inside the town, the red coil was disintegrating. Fear and paranoia became the true commanders. Men started shooting at shadows, at the flicker of movement from a terrified compatriot. Alliances born of greed and violence crumbled in the face of an unseen, unstoppable enemy. Jack had turned Caleb's army against itself. He watched the chaos through his spyglass, his face a stony mask. He felt no pleasure, no thrill. This was a grim, necessary extermination. He saw the men he was killing not as individuals, but as a single entity, a single serpent. The red serpent of the gang's emblem, the serpent of his own past's making. He was not just killing men, he was killing his own failure, one bullet at a time. For an hour, he reigned as the sole, terrifying power over Purgatorio. He moved his position twice, a ghost on the mesas, ensuring they could never pinpoint his location. The town below became a slaughterhouse. The men were trapped, pinned down by a sniper they couldn't see and tormented by a sickness they couldn't fight. The fortress had become their tomb. Finally, as the sun climbed higher in the sky, a figure emerged from the mission chapel. He was tall and defiant, walking into the center of the plaza with a rifle in his hand, a look of pure, incandescent rage on his face. It was Caleb Shaw. He screamed into the wind, his voice raw with fury, challenging the ghost to show itself. Jack watched his protege, his greatest mistake, standing amidst the carnage he had wrought. The time for long-range killing was over. He lowered the Sharps rifle. This final debt had to be paid up close. He picked up Lucille, his Colt, and began the long walk down from the mesa. The Reaper was coming to Purgatorio to personally collect the final soul. Jack entered Purgatorio through the shattered remains of the main gate. The town was a scene from a nightmare. The air was thick with the smoke of the explosion and the stench of death. Bodies lay scattered across the plaza, some victims of his rifle, others of their own panicked, fratricidal gunfire. The few remaining mercenaries were broken, either huddled in terror or trying to flee the cursed town. Jack ignored them. They were no longer soldiers, they were just scared men, and his war was not with them. His focus was on the mission chapel at the far end of the plaza. The great wooden doors were closed. The silence that had fallen over the town was heavier and more menacing than the earlier chaos. He walked across the plaza, his boots crunching on spent shell casings and shattered glass. He was a solitary, grim figure, a ghost walking through the graveyard he had created. As he reached the steps of the chapel, the large doors creaked open. Caleb Shaw stood in the doorway, a rifle held loosely in his hands. He was no longer the screaming, enraged man from the plaza. His face was calm, his eyes burning with an unnerving, feverish intensity. There was a faint, mocking smile on his lips. "I knew it was you," Caleb said, his voice quiet, almost conversational. "No one else could do this. No one else would have the cold, bastard heart for it. My old teacher." "This is over, Caleb," Jack said, his own voice a low, flat rumble. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, his hand resting on the grip of Lucille. "Over," Caleb laughed, a sound that was sharp and brittle. "It's just beginning. You see this, Jack? This is what you taught me. You taught me that the world is a violent, ugly place, and the only way to survive is to be the most violent, ugly thing in it. You taught me that might makes right, that the man with the gun and the will to use it makes the rules. I taught you to be a soldier," Jack corrected, his voice dangerously low. "Not a butcher of women and children." The mention of the Stagecoach Massacre made Caleb's smile widen. Collateral damage. The price of building a new world. That little girl. She was a sacrifice on the altar of progress. Something you never had the stomach for, Jack. You always pulled back at the end. You always let that woman's ghost hold you back. The mention of Sarah was like a knife twist. "Leave her out of this," Jack growled. "Why?" "She's the reason you're a hypocrite," Caleb taunted, taking a step forward. "You were the best, the most ruthless killer on the border. A true artist. And you threw it all away to drive a damn stagecoach. You tried to bury the wolf, Jack. But I chose to feed him." The final confrontation was not just a gunfight. It was a battle of philosophies, a clash between the man Jack had been and the monster that man had created. "It ends now," Jack said, his hand closing around Lucille's grip. "Yes," Caleb agreed, raising his rifle. "It does." The gunfight was a blur of motion and sound, a symphony of violence played by two masters. Caleb, younger and faster, fired first, a wild volley from his rifle that splintered the wooden steps at Jack's feet. But Jack was not there. He had moved with an old predator's instinct, diving to the side, rolling, and coming up firing Lucille. The long-barreled Colt sang its terrible song. Jack's shots were not wild. They were precise, economical notes of death. The first shot took a chunk out of the adobe wall near Caleb's head, forcing him back into the chapel. The second shattered the rifle stock in his hands, rendering it useless. Caleb roared in frustration and drew his own pistol, one with the red serpent carved into the grip. The fight moved inside the chapel, a dark, cavernous space where saints stared down from stained glass windows, their faces impassive witnesses to the sacrilege. They exchanged shots in the gloom, their muzzle flashes illuminating the pews and the altar in brief, hellish tableaus. It was a deadly dance between mentor and student. Caleb was fast and aggressive, his movements fueled by a mad prophet's fire. But Jack was cold, patient, and methodical. He used the shadows, the pillars, the terrain of his own making. He knew every move Caleb would make because he had taught them to him. The end came near the altar. Caleb, out of ammunition, threw his empty pistol and lunged with a knife he had drawn from his boot. It was a final, desperate act of primal violence. Jack met the charge. He didn't fire his last bullet. He holstered his gun and met his student hand to hand, a final, brutal lesson. The fight was short and savage. Jack, despite his age, was stronger, his movements honed by a lifetime of brutal efficiency. He disarmed Caleb, broke his wrist, and slammed him back against the stone altar. He held the younger man by the throat, looking into his burning, hate-filled eyes. "You were a good soldier, Caleb," Jack rasped, his voice filled with a profound, bitter sorrow. "You could have been a good man. And you could have been a king," Caleb choked out, a bloody smile on his lips. Jack drew the knife from Caleb's own belt. He looked at the boy he had trained, the monster he had created, the final, living embodiment of his greatest failure. And with a single, clean motion, he ended it. As dawn broke, a second time, over the dead town of Purgatorio, Jack Rowan stood alone in the desecrated chapel. He was wounded, exhausted, and profoundly empty. The fire of his rage had burned itself out, leaving behind only the cold ashes of his grief and guilt. He found Caleb's saddlebags near the altar. Inside, amongst personal effects and ammunition, was the rest of Abernathy's stolen ledger. He took it and walked out into the morning light. The few remaining mercenaries who had survived the night had long since fled, leaving the town to its dead. Jack walked to the edge of town, to the same cliffside where he had started his assault. He built a small fire and, page by page, fed the ledger to the flames. He watched them curl and blacken, the evidence of Marcus Thorne's conspiracy turning to ash and drifting away on the desert wind. His goal had never been legal justice. The world of courts and lawyers was a foreign country to him now. His was a more personal, more final reckoning. As the last page burned, he heard the sound of approaching horses. A large posse, flying the flag of the U.S. Marshals, was riding hard toward the town. He knew they would have been tracking the trail of bodies he had left across the territory, but they would not find him. He slipped away, using his old skills to vanish into the broken rock of the Malpais. The marshals, led by a determined, square-jawed man, found a ghost town. They found a charnel house, a scene of carnage so total it was difficult to comprehend. And on the great wooden doors of the chapel, they found the red coiled serpent symbol, scrawled in what looked like charcoal, with a single, bloody line drawn through it, canceling it out forever. Of the man responsible, there was no sign. Weeks later, a lone rider stopped on a desolate stretch of the Jornada del Muerto. He dismounted at a spot marked by nothing but a few fire-blackened timbers and the ghosts of memory. From his saddlebag, he took a small, crudely carved wooden bird. He knelt and gently placed it on the dusty ground, a silent, solitary memorial for a little girl, for a broken promise, and for the man he had once tried to be. Then, Jack Rowan mounted his horse. He did not look back. He rode on, a solitary figure disappearing into the vast, indifferent landscape, leaving behind nothing but the dust, the silence, and a terrifying new legend for those who would prey on the innocent, the story of the stagecoach driver who had become the reaper, and of the day Lucille had sung her final, terrible song.